April 30th. Three massive events happened on this exact date in American history. In 1789, George Washington took the very first presidential oath, giving life to the American presidency. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase was signed, setting America on a path to nearly double its territory. But on April 30th, 1975, America watched the final chaotic hours of a war it could no longer control. And in the middle of that collapse, American sailors made a decision almost no one could believe. They pushed perfectly functioning helicopters into the sea, not because the helicopters were useless, but because the people still circling above them were running out of fuel. This is the story of Operation Frequent Wind and the agonizing final hours of America's longest war. Shells began to fall before dawn, tearing through the humid darkness around Tan Son Nhut Air Base. The first explosions ripped open the runway, sending concrete and steel skyward. By 3 in the morning, both runways were cratered, gouged by artillery and rocket fire from North Vietnamese batteries pressing in from the northwest. Fuel pits ignited, flames rising out of shattered tarmac, black smoke curling over hangars and control towers. The base, once the lifeline for fixed-wing evacuation flights, was now a graveyard for C-130s and transports that would never fly again. Damage assessment teams radioed in. The main runway was impassable, the secondary strip littered with debris and burning wreckage. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed what ground crews already knew. No plane could land, no plane could take off. The last American pilots who made it out described taxiing through fire, dodging shrapnel, and lifting off under direct mortar attack. For those left behind, the airfield had become a trap. Inside the US Embassy, the news hit with the force of a final verdict. The original plan, orderly and controlled fixed-wing extractions, was gone. The sky was thick with smoke and the distant thunder of artillery. There would be no more flights for the thousands still waiting. Every cable, every radio call from the base repeated the same message: the runways are gone. Helicopters, small enough to land on rooftops, and battered patches of ground were now the only hope. The moment the runways died, the last illusion of control died with them. The evacuation would not be measured or dignified. It would be desperate, improvised, and haunted by the knowledge that time, like the airfield, was running out. At 10:48 a.m., a voice crackled over the embassy radio net. The words were calm, almost clinical. The temperature in Saigon is 105 degrees and rising. Then a pause. The opening notes of Bing Crosby's White Christmas drifted across the airwaves, a song that had not touched Saigon's air in years. For those who knew, the meaning was unmistakable. This was the signal, the coded phrase that unlocked the final phase of evacuation. In that instant, every embassy staffer, every Marine, every pilot listening on the net understood that the plan was no longer theoretical. Operation Frequent Wind was live. The embassy's radio net became the spine of command, its coded language the only thread holding together the chaos. Marines on the roof, pilots circling in the haze, Navy controllers aboard ships 30 miles offshore, all tuned to the same frequency, waiting for orders that would decide who left and who stayed. The city below was unraveling, but the radio net cut through the noise with chilling clarity. Helicopter rotors began to spin, blades slashing the humid air. Crews scrambled on rooftops, carrying children, elders, files, and flags. Pilots, many on their third or fourth sortie without rest, checked fuel gauges already flirting with empty. In the embassy courtyard, the crowd surged against the gates. The coded broadcast had severed the last tie to any illusion of order. Now every minute counted. The airlift was a living thing, continuous, relentless, and utterly dependent on the thin line of communication that started with a single haunting song. The evacuation had become kinetic. irreversible, and the world would never forget the sound of White Christmas echoing over a burning city. Helicopters poured into the sky above the South China Sea, their flight paths overlapping in a frantic, unbroken chain. The USS Midway, anchored 30 nautical miles offshore, became the center of a human tide. Every few minutes, another aircraft dropped onto its deck, engines screaming, rotors flinging salt spray and exhaust. The ship's log would later record nearly 7,000 rescued in just 24 hours, a number that defied belief and nearly broke the men and machines involved. Pilots flew sortie after sortie, eyes bloodshot, hands shaking from adrenaline and fatigue. Some had been flying since dawn, running on little more than coffee, and the memory of orders barked through static. Their voices, captured in cockpit tapes, grew hoarse and ragged. Low on fuel, requesting immediate landing, deck full, holding pattern. Each pass over the fleet meant another gamble with empty tanks. On deck, sailors and Marines sprinted between choppers, guiding them down, yanking open doors, dragging out evacuees, children, parents, the wounded, the terrified. The next helicopter would already be circling, its pilot radioing in with a voice edged by panic. There was no pause, no time to clear the deck before the next arrival. A single misstep, a slip of the boot, a missed hand signal could mean disaster. The Midway's flight deck, built for jets, was now a crowded, shifting puzzle of steel, spinning blades, and desperate people. The air was thick with the smell of fuel and fear. Crewmen counted the minutes, then stopped counting. Each landing brought relief and dread in equal measure. Another group saved, another machine blocking the only safe space left. The pressure mounted with every shriek of an approaching rotor. The density of helicopters on deck reached a point where movement itself became impossible, and the line between rescue and catastrophe blurred. The only certainty was that exhaustion was winning, and the window for escape was closing fast. The order came down fast and flat, spoken into the wind by a voice that left no room for hesitation. On the decks of the USS Midway, Hancock and Coral Sea, sailors stood shoulder to shoulder, sweat and salt stinging their eyes as the command passed from officer to chief, from chief to the men at the rails, clear the deck. Helicopters, still gleaming with fresh paint, engines cooling, some with family photos taped to the instrument panels, were not broken, not empty, not even out of fuel. But above, in the haze, more were circling with refugees and pilots on the edge of collapse, their tanks running dry, their hope measured in minutes. A bosun's mate wrapped his hands around the cold metal of a push bar, locking eyes with the man beside him. Together, they braced their boots and leaned into the weight of a CH-46 Sea Knight. The machine resisted, then rolled, rotors tied down, doors still swinging open. A final shove sent 40,000 pounds of steel and memory over the edge, vanishing into the South China Sea with a hollow splash. Then another and another. Some men shouted, others just stared, mouths tight, as the count climbed, 12 here, 7 there, 45 in all, before the decks were clear enough for the next wave to touch down. Deck logs recorded the time, 1340 hours. Oral histories would remember the silence that followed, a hush broken only by the whine of incoming rotors and the distant rising cries from the hangar deck. Each helicopter lost was a sacrifice measured against the lives still waiting above the city. For the sailors who pushed, the memory lasted long after the oil slicks faded, long after the world stopped watching. The sea took the machines, but the image, steel giants tumbling, men watching helpless, became a scar on the American story. A moment when saving people meant letting go of everything else. At 7:53 a.m., the last helicopter lifted away from the U.S. Embassy roof. The moment arrived without ceremony. No speeches, no final salute, just the heavy thump of rotors, the sharp blast of exhaust, and the weight of too many eyes watching from below. The Marine pilot in the cockpit, face streaked with sweat and soot, kept his hands steady on the controls. He had flown through darkness, through tracer fire, through the clamor of desperate voices pressed against the embassy gates. Now, as the aircraft rose above the city, the silence inside was almost unbearable. Below, Saigon was unraveling. Smoke curled from distant fires. The streets that had once been alive with the noise of traffic and commerce were now choked with the ghostly hush of abandonment. On the embassy rooftop, the last Marines waited for their turn, rifles slung, boots planted on the hot concrete, listening for the next set of blades that would not come. Their orders were clear: hold until relieved. But relief in the end was a single helicopter and a one-way flight out. The embassy logs captured the time, 7:53 a.m. local. The pilot's report, filed later with trembling hands, simply read, "Final lift. All personnel accounted for." There was no triumph in those words, only the exhaustion of a mission carried out to its bitter end. As the helicopter banked toward the sea, the city faded from view. Below, the gates of the compound gave way, and the last hopes of those left behind dissolved into the morning heat. For the men in the cockpit, the sound of the engine was the only proof that they were still moving. The war was over, not with a declaration, but with the quiet exhale of a city surrendered to history. The last lift was not an escape, but a witness, one final act recorded to the minute, as America's longest war slipped into memory. Tonight, the image of helicopters sinking beneath black waves still haunts American memory. The desperation on those decks shattered the illusion of control, exposing the true cost of lost alliances and abandoned promises. History waits for no one. The echo of Saigon warns, even superpowers